Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our participants who are joining us today. My name is Ria Ligari. I'm the Community of Practice Consultant for the UN Women Training Center, and I'm very glad to welcome you all to this virtual dialogue webinar on privilege, power, and training for gender equality. We're very lucky to have a large audience and 4 expert panelists with us today. So before we begin, if we go to the next slide, you'll see on your screens a brief outline of today's webinar. So first, we'll go through logistics and how this webinar works, so that everyone can participate fully. And then I'm going to introduce today's topic and the panelists who will each speak to us in turn. And finally, we'll have time to answer your questions about today's webinar after the panelists have given their presentations. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about logistics. And so please note that we have a questions tab on the GoToWebinar platform. So you can send in your questions at any time using this questions option. And so I'll pose your questions to the panelists after their presentations. And I should also mention that this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be posted on the UN Women Training Center's YouTube channel after the event. So if we go to the 4th slide, we can see today's panelists who we're very excited to have with us today. We have Dr. Lucy Ferguson, we have Laxman Belbase, and we have Dr. Joanne Sandler. We were also going to have Dr. Andrea Cornwall, who may or may not log in soon, but we hope she'll also be able to join us. And I'll introduce each panelist in detail right before they begin their presentations. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just recap what virtual dialogues are before we begin with our presentations. So virtual dialogues at the UN Women Training Center, we believe in creating knowledge and sharing learning in a participatory manner. So this is really the drive between our virtual dialogues. They're mechanisms for us as training practitioners to continually discuss, exchange, and share knowledge and nurture a community of collective learning across the world. So these dialogues are part webinar and part discussion forum. So I hope you'll all be able to join the discussion forum and keep these debates alive after this event. And at the end of the webinar, I'll explain how we can, how each of you can access the COP discussion forum. And so this is the first virtual dialogue that's been hosted by the UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice in 2019. The COP is an open platform for dialogue and knowledge sharing for participants from around the world. Our members represent governments and civil society, academia, UN agencies. And so if we go to the next slide, let's start talking about today's topic, which is privilege, power. So we're here to discuss how privilege and power relate to training for gender equality. So as we know, gender inequalities around the world are a reflection of gendered power structures. And at its core, power is established to retain advantages and privileges. So by privilege, basically we mean automatic unearned benefits that are bestowed upon perceived members of dominant groups based on their social identity. So identity markers like sex, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality, age, disability, education, socioeconomic background, occupation, location, all of these intersectional identity markers confer privileges and bestow power on some and disadvantage others. So we know that to achieve gender equality through training and beyond, we have to address gendered power relations and the privileges that underlie them. So that brings us to the next slide, which is our objectives for today's webinar, which will be to answer 2 basic questions. Why do privilege and power matter for training for gender equality? And secondly, how can we address privilege and power through and within training for gender equality? So to reflect on these broad questions, we're now going to turn to our panelists' presentations. And our first panelist today is Dr. Lucy Ferguson. So I'm just going to unmute Lucy. And we're very lucky to have Lucy with us today. Lucy is a specialist in gender equality and women's empowerment. She's written extensively on engaging with privilege in order to facilitate lasting transformation through training for gender equality. She's also worked with several international organizations, including the UN Women Training Center and academic institutions like the Graduate Institute of Geneva. So Lucy, I'm very happy to give you the floor. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Excited to be on a panel with my co-panelists and a topic which I hope we can move forward with thinking about. This is something that, of course, we've been writing about in feminist work for a long time, and also from the field of privilege studies, and Black feminist thought has written a lot about privilege. My work in this area intersects with my work on training for gender equality, or gender training, and the brief talk that I'm going to give today draws on a paper that was published in February of this year called Exploring Privilege Through Feminist Gender Training, and that's published in the European Journal of Politics and Gender, which was a special issue about gender expertise. So really my thinking about how we deal with privilege in gender training is based in our feminist pedagogical approach that we developed with the UN Women Training Centre, whereby feminist pedagogies are embedded. Can we go to the next slide, please? Embedded in a commitment to feminist critique, which challenges the basis of all knowledge and ways of knowing, and is also grounded in a feminist project which aims to transform oppressive and interlocking power relations in pursuit of a world characterized by increased social justice. So these kind of feminist pedagogical principles and practices for gender training intersect in my paper with an analysis of privilege studies pedagogy. So taking from Case 2013, that's a pedagogy that analyzes privilege and power in teaching about privilege, pushing the boundaries of teaching multiculturalism, diversity, or oppression and discrimination. So in this paper, I tried to mix feminist pedagogical approaches, privilege studies, and also specifically privilege pedagogies. And building on that literature, I ask, how can feminist pedagogical principles be operationalized in gender training scenarios in order to explore privilege in critical, dynamic ways? And I think it's just important to acknowledge, as Ria has done in the concept note and in the work of my co-panelists, that often the pedagogical foundations of gender training are developed based for grounded in consciousness raising, in working with NGOs, maybe in working in development contexts, and are not necessarily particularly sophisticatedly adapted for when we're working with the elite and those in power. So that's really what I'm interested in. How do we work most effectively as gender trainers when we're working with those who are in positions of privilege and not necessarily the most marginalized and the most vulnerable? Next slide, please. So I'm interested in how feminist pedagogical principles intersect with working on privilege. First, thinking about the feminist classroom, there's a lot of Black feminists who've written on the assumptions that we may have as teachers about who is the teacher, and so therefore I'd posit the same question about the trainer, the importance of reflexivity and the positionality of the trainer in developing a feminist classroom, so that we kind of put our own privileges out there at the beginning, so it's not a kind of oppositional approach, but rather we're working together to construct and deconstruct and understand each other's privileges. So I've looked quite extensively at privilege studies and the kinds of techniques used there. And from privilege studies, they kind of say, well, let's be careful because a lot of critical pedagogy is tied to Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, not necessarily always dealing with the oppressed. So I think it's important to move beyond those assumptions. And Alan and Rosato's work is particularly interesting because they argue that in order to work with oppressors or the privileged, we need a significant emotional and cognitive experience in the training. And I think for a lot of us, this is what we try and do with our training anyway, but achieving that in practice, I think, is quite different to planning it in our training plans. And I think one of the ways of doing this in terms of listening to a feminist class, in terms of developing a feminist classroom, means revising the centering of voice and the idea of always placing the student or participant at the center, because in some cases it might be that some people need to talk less and learn to listen rather than necessarily be given constantly a voice and placed at the center. So I think that's an area that we can work on. Again, from Alan and Rosato, I really like this a quotation, no easy, comfortable exercises will do when it comes to subverting and dismantling the territories of the oppressor. And I think this is really relevant for gender training, that we are encouraged to and often default to those easy, comfortable exercises. But how can we push ourselves to go beyond if we really want to work with privilege? Next slide, please. Following on from this, we work hard on the validation of personal experience, another pillar of feminist pedagogies, where we respect everyone's ideas and where they've come from and their own experiences. But I think this can get us into trouble when we're working with privilege. Coverhand's work is really useful on this, where she talks about how we generate anxiety and emotional or defensive responses when we talk about male privilege. She distinguishes between gender knowledge and expertise about gender inequality, and I think that's helpful. The quotation here, ideas about gender can vary hugely, ranging from personalized anecdote and essentialist assumptions to a rejection of gender binaries or nuanced plans concerning the amelioration of the gender pay gap, etc. I also draw on the work of Wecker, who talks about white innocence in the concept of the Netherlands, where it's very difficult to challenge Dutch people about racism, as they believe themselves to be inherently colourblind, egalitarian, and anti-racist. And she talks about the bracketing of race, making it into an optional variable. And I found this really, really struck a chord with me in terms of working with UN agencies and other public organisations with this notion of male innocence. And I think that can be developed where we look at these unquestioned assumptions about individuals and institutions believing themselves to be naturally or inherently non-sexist, merely because they have an external mission embedded in liberal norms of promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. And I think that that's something, that's an interesting line that we can look down further in terms of the theoretical work. And I really like the term about epistemological nausea that Case develops. So when you start to confront students and participants with privilege, this is how they experience, because whereas before bearers of multiple privilege were allowed to feel normal, now these intersectional explorations of privilege whirl us all around repeatedly. And I think that's what our job is as gender trainers, dealing with these, to whirl everyone around repeatedly. In terms of practical exercises, I think many of us know these, and I go into them a lot more detail in the paper. For example, a privilege test. You can do a privilege test made up of any questions that you want. You can start with Macintosh's checklist of male privilege, or there are examples all over the internet that you can pick and choose depending on the group. These kind of more light-hearted exercise allow space to reject or dispute the results, but at least create a space for discussion. Excuse me. I think we know the power walk, and most people have used that, but I find more and more that it can be a very powerful tool. It's a very simple exercise. If you're not familiar with it, we can send you the information for that activity, because it does encourage people to confront in a very physical way their multiple intersecting privileges and discriminations. In terms of future directions, on the next slide, I'm really interested in developing applied theatre for training for gender equality. Andrea Cornwall, one of our co-panelists today, has done a lot of work on this, and I draw on her work in my paper. And this is something I'm trying to work on in my own practice as a gender trainer in the last few months. It's the same issue really as with gender training, that applied theatre has often also been about working with the oppressed rather than those best placed to bring about change. We have some examples, and there's an excellent book, The Applied Theatre Reader, which is full of examples of how theatre can be used, but just not in a gender training scenario. For example, hidden theatre, in which members of national and European parliaments recite the stories of asylum seekers alongside actors and refugees. And it's really about how the theatrical force of empathy is let loose upon those who have the power to make and unmake the legal framework. So we're moving beyond trying to persuade, we're moving beyond trying to justify, we're moving beyond trying to convince, and what we're trying to do is activate empathy and activate different ways of engaging the privileged in working towards gender training in institutions. Other tools that can be used are forum theatre, narrative theatre, image theatre, and I talk more specifically about those in the paper. And again, I'm playing around with them in my gender training. Sometimes they work better than others, and a lot of it depends on how receptive the audience is. But I'm really finding that this kind of work is getting us further and further away from the hang-ups and the stereotypes that people have as soon as they hear the word gender and begin to close up straight away. I think there are other ways that we can work to get to people in power, to engage them in a more meaningful way, which will hopefully have stronger powers to lead to transformation. So I just have a few concluding thoughts on the final slide, please. I think there are three key challenges on addressing privilege in gender training scenarios. The first is resistances, and of course resistance is understood as a necessary part of a transformative process, but nevertheless not easy to deal with. Secondly, conflicting epistemologies of people who have always thought that the world was the way they saw it, and then you realize that not having to think about things is in fact a privilege. And then the limitations of gender training as a forum. We often feel frustrated by the limitations of our format. So again, as I always encourage us to do, what can we do within the time and the space and the remit that we've got? In the paper, I engage with Black feminist epistemologies a lot in trying to overcome some of these tensions. I like Patricia Collins' insight that Black women acknowledge a strong connection between what one does and how one thinks. And I think this opens up avenues for different ways of thinking about knowledge about gender. Moreover, this notion that oppression and by extension privilege is not simply understood in the mind offers a tangible starting point for using theatre and other movements to get to the ways in which privilege is felt in the body, not just oppression. And finally, I argue in my paper, and I hope to be able to do this in future work in gender training, that we need new and innovative ways of doing feminist gender training. But not just doing it, but exploring how we can look for feminist ways of being in gender training and trying to summon the transformative courage to collaboratively construct a fiercely feminist gender training, one that moves beyond training's often technocratic form and explicitly engages with privilege in order to facilitate tangible, lasting transformation for gender equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was a fantastic presentation, and as always, and thank you so much for joining us today. Lucy will be part in the Q&A session because she has to catch a train in half an hour, but she will be available via email, and I will be passing on your questions to her as you post them, especially on the COP discussion forum. Thank you so much. And we've also got with us today Dr. Andrea Cornwall, who's joined us. So Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll just introduce you to her. Andrea Cornwall is Dr. Andrea Cornwall of SOAS at the University of London, is a political anthropologist who specializes in the anthropology of participation and democracy, participatory research, masculinities, women's empowerment, women's rights, gender and sexuality. She's written extensively on making visible the dynamics of gender power in organizations as part of strategies for change to advance gender equality. So Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to ask you to please begin your presentation, but I see that there may be some problem with your, okay, now I think your microphone should be working. Yes, perfect.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
Hello, have you got a slide to put up for me so I don't need to, yeah, so yes. The webcam, if that's okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay.
You've got a slide.
Brilliant, thank you. So thank you very much indeed, Lucy. That was so interesting, and it's a real pleasure to be able to follow on from what you were saying, because I think what I have to say resonates with what you're saying. And what I'm going to focus on is taking some of what Lucy has said and thinking from a similar standpoint and thinking about pedagogy and privilege in a similar kind of way, about how can we take this into our practice. And I'm going to talk a bit then specifically about methods, about ways of bringing this into our gender training. And methods that we can use to engage people in that process of reflection. And I think a really important point that was made is that by using methodologies like theatre to enable people to think differently about the stuff that they take for granted, we can work with people around their privilege and also around the ways in which they engage with other people's privilege to disrupt it and to make it visible. So I'd like to start by thinking a bit about power. And I think what's key to feminist perspectives on power is not only looking at power over and looking at oppressive forms of power, but also looking at what power can do for gender equality. So the idea of power to, which is power as agency, it's very important in relation to empowerment. The idea of power with, building a sense of solidarity, of building collective engagement, collective action, again, a very important way of thinking about how things can be done differently to disrupt patriarchal forms of power and the exercise of power over. And power within, so how to tap into our own sense of our own power and activate us all as people who can work to be able to challenge inequalities of power, challenge oppression, and challenge some of the effects that patriarchy has in producing those kinds of naturalized inequalities. So I think let's think about power then in this more complex way and think about different dimensions of empowerment in relation to that, and think about how gender training, by working with privilege in these ways, can disrupt some of the things we've come to take for granted, the practices that are part of our everyday lives, help to make those visible, help to enable us to be critical of them and to look at what their consequences are, and then to think together about how do we build the power to, power with, and power within to change some of those conditions of inequality. And I think again here, the concept we use, a concept that's very useful for me, I found, is the concept of patriarchy. It's an old concept, but it's been used, it's been brought back, I think, more recently. Patriarchy is particularly useful, and I find it sometimes more useful than gender equality to think with in training, because everybody is affected by it. Whether you're male, whether you're female, whether you're trans, whoever you are, patriarchy can affect you negatively, can produce effects that are negative for you. And I think also women as well as men can sustain patriarchy. In fact, through the ways in which women permit men in some situations to behave either in a workplace setting, sometimes in a family, almost also sometimes the way that mothers bring up their sons. These are all ways in which can sustain patriarchy. It's not blaming women for those situations, but they're ways in which, by thinking differently and framing differently and acting differently, we can begin to disrupt some of these forms of behaviour. So thinking now about how in a training context we can work with this, the very first step is to make those patriarchal values, attitudes, practices, arrangements, make them visible, make them strange to people who might have taken them for granted. And so some of the techniques I'm going to talk about are part of that making strange, part of that representation, presenting to ourselves the things that maybe we've always done things that way, we've always thought things that way, that's what people do. And that's a very important sort of intellectual technique for feminism. It's been part of the ways in which feminists have disrupted some of those ways, those arrangements that are unfair and unequal. But it's also a very important methodology and a sort of way of working of participatory approaches, which has been to say, let's take a step back from what we take for granted and let's look at it more closely. Let's create an artifact, a piece of theatre, a piece of drawing, a piece of writing, a piece of analysis that will allow us to examine that more clearly. So what I'm going to introduce is a series of ways of doing this, but just to take you through a process for it. So the first step then is to make some way of making the familiar strange, making visible to people elements of their life worlds, elements of their everyday workspaces, their everyday lives, so that they can look at them. The second step is to look, and this can be done both to look critically at what's going on there, but also to look at some of the short-term payoffs in that situation. And this is a technique that I draw from assertiveness training, which is to look at, well, why do we carry on doing these things? What's in it for us on a short term? So it's much easier to not challenge things. It's much easier not to take risks. It's much easier to just let things carry on because it's quite risky to open up discussions, to challenge power. And then to look at the longer term consequences of sustaining these ways of behaving. So what's the longer term outcomes for people where things are completely unequal? What's the longer term consequences if bullying and sort of violent behaviour is not challenged? So that whole question about working with people about, well, yes, there might be whole loads of reasons why we don't act or we don't challenge things, but actually, where's this getting us longer term? And that process, that cognitive process of separating out the payoffs, the normative attachments, the ways in which we end up locked into these kinds of inequalities and actually things that we can do to change them is quite a powerful process in itself. And enables people to analyse the inequalities and unfairnesses that are bound up in those arrangements and relations. And then the third step is to analyse the work that needs to be done and that can be done and the steps that can be taken to begin to change things. And that's a very important piece of it. So it's not just saying, well, life is unfair, I feel this unfairness, now I've revealed to myself how awful it is and all these awful effects it's going to have on me, I can't do anything to change it. It's then taking a step back from it and saying, okay, we've looked at all of this and now what can we do? What steps can we take? And the steps may be small, but through small concerted acts done together, huge changes can come about. So that question of saying, you know, you train somebody in gender inequality in dealing with some of these dimensions of power, and they can begin to take action themselves in their everyday lives, actual concrete things that they can do. It can make them feel that sense of power too. Power within and power with. So I'm going to talk now just briefly about a range of different kinds of methods that I've used that are borrowed from all kinds of other practices, just as a way of sparking off some thoughts about what tools you could use for this. I detail them in the reading that I've sent round, so you'll see them described in more detail there, but I'm just going to talk about them briefly now. So part of one group of those tools is to do with drawing. So drawing out understandings and meanings, drawing out words. So one technique is to give people large pieces of flip chart paper and put on them a series of words. So you might have masculine, you might have feminine, you might have woman, you might have man. And then to unpack all of those words and say, well, what are all the associations we've got with those words? And what does it mean when we look at those words? What are we really saying about what it means to be gendered? And this can be, I found, a really interesting way to explore the limiting thinking that we have around the gender binary, how we put categories around where we classify men and women in ways that are very, very different, where there are lots of oppositional ways of thinking about them. Women and men can either be like this or like that. The ways in which we make assumptions about locking into assumptions about sexuality, about the idea of gender as these two categories rather than more of a spectrum. It helps you to challenge homophobic, transphobic or heteronormative assumptions, as well as really get into some of the assumptions that limit our thinking about women and men, and really start to challenge some of the inequalities. Another exercise that I've used is, again, using flip charts, is just to write on them women should, women shouldn't, men should, men shouldn't, and get almost like a graffiti board and get the whole room, just put the papers on the floor, get people writing on them, all the things that they've heard, that they heard from their church, that they heard from their mosque or from their school or from their grandparents or from their classmates or from their friends or from men in the street, all the things, the messages that we've heard about what we should and shouldn't do. And then to use that to read out all of the shouldn'ts and all of the shoulds, and then to think, what does that feel like? You see a jumble of contradictions. You hear a series of messages that don't add up to a single consistent set of messages. But also we hear a lot of messages that we ourselves resist in our own lives. And so I found this a really good exercise to get away from really narrow assumptions about what it means to be gendered, to get away from stereotypes about men and about women and about the relations between them, but also to talk about some of the baggage that we're carrying, cultural, social baggage, about how we're expected to behave and how difficult it can be to break with those ways when they're carrying all of those messages that we've carried from our childhoods and through all of our social environments are continually being reinforced. And I think of it as a reality check, and I also think of it as a way of raising consciousness about how problematic those messages are. So in one of the trainings I've done, we did this, and I asked the women to read out to the men a list of all the injunctions, all of the men should, men shouldn't, And then to say, well, how does that make you feel to hear that list? And how hard it is to be all those things? And what does it mean then for those people who have to be constantly being sort of chastised or being, you know, reminded that this is what they're supposed to live up to? But also where they're being so maligned with these assumptions about what it is to be a man or a woman. So that's one. I'm running out of time, I think, so I'll just talk about a couple more. Another one which I really enjoy doing, again, this thing of actually looking at power, looking at empowerment, but also looking at categorization and at stereotyping, and the ways in which power also works through discourse to make us feel subject to needing to behave in particular ways. And that is to have a series of cards and divide the group into two and get them to generate every single category, stereotype, insult that's gendered that they can think of. And then to put them all out on the floor and look at power and think about pairs of kinds of people, how they might view each other, and the ways in which our own limiting thinking can be as much part of gender inequality. And to use that to get beyond a very narrow account of gender as being about male dominance and the oppression of women by men, and to look at how power can work between women, between men, and how power intersects with other forms of difference, including status and class difference. And lastly, using another drawing technique is to use, and Lucy talked about privilege and techniques for addressing a powerful intersectional device, looking at these different dimensions of difference and how much we are associated with different dimensions of privilege and can use our privilege as well as be blind to the benefits that privilege gives us. So I'd just like to conclude by reflecting very quickly on the use of applied theatre. And I think it was a very important point that Lucy made about all of the ways in which theatre acting out and creating what could be called a liminal space, a space in between, that you can rehearse for reality and you can play out things that happen in your reality in a relatively safe way, how powerful that can be in gender training. And I've used this a lot to set up little skits, just a couple of minutes long, that are kind of examples of everyday life, where people play out things that they've seen, and then you review them, you think about them, you stop them as the action's going and ask people what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And you play them again with people taking up the characters and stopping the action and starting the action again. And these are all techniques from the work of Auguste Boal and the Theatre of the Oppressed. And he has rehearsal techniques in a very good book called Games for Actors and Non-Actors that can be used in gender training. And also his practices of invisible theatre, forum theatre and legislative theatre are very powerful in gender training. And I'll just say a couple of words on each of those things. Invisible theatre is where you use dramatic action in a public space where people are not expecting there to be actors or plays. So it's, Lucy referred to this, going out, using invisible theatre in a meeting or in the street to act out something that will create some attention or will cause some friction or will get people to think or do differently. And it can be a kind of form of guerrilla theatre where suddenly people are forced to challenge themselves about what they're assuming. Forum theatre, which is the technique I've just referred to when I talked about people doing a skit and running it again and stopping it and replacing the characters. And the idea with forum theatre is to show a character being progressively ground into the ground and oppressed. And people can stop the action in different places and run it differently. And the character does things differently and people behave towards them differently. And it's a way of showing how you can change a situation through your own agency. And lastly, legislative theatre, which is a way of acting out policy situations or things that need to change, and then looking at what would change the action, what kind of legal frameworks, what kind of interventions could change the action. Anyway, these are just some thoughts following on from Lucy's presentation about what you can do as a trainer. And I look forward to carrying on tuning in and hearing what the other participants, the other speakers have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was a wonderful presentation and very, very powerful examples. And you'll see on your screens, there's a link to Dr. Cornwall's paper on Towards a Pedagogy for the Powerful, but we'll also be circulating this to you all in the email that you'll receive after the webinar. And I'll be posting all of the links to Lucy's paper and Andrea's paper, and also to the all the other resources that were mentioned on the COP discussion forum, which we'll discuss at the end of the webinar, how you can all access that. So now I'd like to hand over to our third speaker, who I'll just introduce. And we're very lucky to be joined by not just Dr. Lucy Ferguson and Dr. Andrea Cornwall, but also by Laxman Belbase, who is joining us from MenEngage, the MenEngage Alliance. Laxman is a social worker and a gender justice activist. He is an expert on program development, implementation, and advocacy in fields like gender equality, child protection, violence prevention, engaging boys and men for social justice, fatherhood, sexual and reproductive health and rights, comprehensive sexuality education, and he's worked across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So Laxman, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'd like to hand over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to Lucy and Andrea for giving such a great beginning. And I think I would also, pick up from the issues around pedagogy and epistemology that we use generally during the gender trainings that we use, with a concept which I got to know somewhere, 4 or 5 years back, around the reflexivity, and how do we use that as an approach in creating the reflections among the people in the training itself, so that it can really become something that really, something that really touches their heart, so that they can be inspired. If you can go to the next slide, really to to make things visible is one, particularly the approach I generally use as well, but also become very cognizant of what is it that you want to make visible about in the trainings, because we will be talking about so many concepts and so many complex topics in a particular training or a capacity building workshop. And given the fact of the capacity among individuals to grasp and struggle with when it comes to looking at various new concepts potentially for a lot of people in the room, but also to make sure that we do an analysis of who are we talking with and who are in the room, so that we can make best use of the knowledge that lies there. I think as a facilitator, sometimes what Lucy was referring to earlier, the division and the distinction between teacher versus trainer versus facilitator might be helpful to have given some thought before we engage in any kind of a workshop or activity in the groups. So I think the overall concept around how do we make the power and privilege at the core of whatever conversation we do, with various participatory exercises that we can do, but also bring in some fundamental elements, because we have to make sure through these facilitated exercises to help people understand that it is not about just about them, but also there is a larger picture where they can play a very constructive role in the process to disrupt, to make certain things uneasy. And I think as a facilitator, we need to be specific around how do we really bring those nuanced dynamics and elements in the room. And I think one simple example, which I think Lucy was also referring to, a simple exercise such as what a day look like for a man and a woman in a same family in a particular context. And that can really start opening up and helping people to visually see how much of differences and workload and the roles and expectations are there with regards to the gender dimensions or gender differentiations that are there within the family, and then cuts across with the A's and then race and ethnicity and religion as well. And just to bring in the idea of the fact that life is not something, a very linear process, but a complex system whereby multiple identities do intersect, and the experiences of the same individual also varies from context to context. And how do we bring that element into the picture when we talk about patriarchy and then masculinities? And primarily, my sort of inputs for today's conversation would be, how do we work with boys and men in specific who has been on the higher end of the patriarchal power system and the privileges that they have been enjoying. So if we can go to the next slide. yeah, these are some of the things that, one thing probably on the androgynous kind of a culture that currently exists with something to do with, in the training itself, I think sometimes it's okay to present, what we think is ideal and etc. But my experience with working at the community level with children and young people, including, is that if you facilitate the conversation in a way that it can actually help bring the existing androgynous type kind of traditions already in the communities, which kind of counteracts with the whole ideology of how patriarchy operates and how power operates and the multiple experiences and intersecting and contradicting experiences of power among people in the room. Sorry, next slide. This has been referred earlier again, is again, as a facilitator, as a teacher, it's again from the pedagogy of Opres, Paulo Ferreiro. And then, to help, to come in a room as a facilitator, not as a teacher, but then someone who can facilitate this conversation so that the group that what we are working with becomes self-competent or feels self-empowered to take some necessary steps. And I think in some cases where we may trigger something, and that have happened, and I come from Nepal and South Asia background, and one of the courses we used to run in South Asia, at one training, what really happened when we were interrogating the fact around patriarchy and privileges among boys and men and how that intersects with their own lives, many a times it ends up disrupting so much among the participants, irrespective of what gender identities you have, because of the fact power and privilege works in such a contradictory manner that it cuts simply beyond the gender binary approach of looking and understanding the social roles and expectations that each one of us have. But then, boiling down that to be what it means to be a human, it really becomes an empowerment and disruptive system to the whole notion and understanding of how we should be living together as people. Next slide, please. So I think, here, just to look at giving an example of how can different tools, whether it's to do with a participatory approach, and sometimes we also most often, our members, as well as I have used theater, but in a different mode, more kind of a forum theater approach, and we use that as a part of a facilitation tool to engage in a conversation where we can have reflections around certain particular practical experiences that needs to be investigated. And I think, as a facilitator, sometimes we tend to indulge in such in depth in looking at the experiences that needs to be investigated. If you can click the next, we forget to bring back the broader picture, because then sometimes in the trainings what we end up doing is putting certain individual or a group to a focus, but then forget to bring the larger picture, the systems problems and systematic approach into the picture. So, and then, one of the approaches around reflexivity and creating and utilizing that as a facilitation process, if you can continue clicking, there will be multiple things coming up. And because individuals or groups or irrespective of where we are located and situated, our reactions will depend on these experiences and what we think is right at that particular point in time. That drives the feelings and thoughts. And then, once we kind of bring them out of this very narrow looking into the problem, but then it becomes kind of a learning insights into the dynamics and become self-discovery process on an individual of a participants as well. And then that brings back again the controlling of the feelings and fears. When we talk about disrupting and taking about power, then question comes out that, are we asking people to give up the power or give up the privilege, which becomes another level of conversation, so that we can diffuse the feeling of sort of powerlessness or loss of something, because it is not a zero-sum game in the end. As Andrea was mentioning, how do we make sure those feelings and thoughts and the positions and the political steps we empower people to become well-informed through these experiences? Yeah, next, if there is, I think there are few thoughts that I wanted to share, but I think Andrea and Lucy already covered that quite a lot already. So I think I would stop there for now and engage more in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Laxman. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. And we've been getting lots of excellent questions from our audience, so I'll be posing those to you and to the other speakers after our next and final presentation for today, which is Dr. Joanne Sandler. So I'm very happy to introduce our final speaker, who is Dr. Joanne Sandler of Gender at Work. She's an expert on women's rights and organizational change strategies, and she's collaborated with a number of international organizations, academic institutions, women's organizations. She was also UNIFEM's Deputy Executive Director for Programs and was on the transition team for the establishment of UN Women. She's also currently on the board of directors of Breakthrough and of Women Win. So Joanne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you all for, thank you. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Thank you all. Thank you to the UN Women Training Center and talking about privilege. It is such a privilege to be on a webinar with Andrea and Lucy and Laxman. And I'm conscious that everyone has been listening for a very long time as we talk about participation. So I will try to go very quickly. Next slide, please. I'm going to mostly talk today about a workshop that on transformative leadership for gender equality that my colleague at Gender at Work, Aruna Rao, and I developed that was commissioned by the UN Women Training Center. So again, gratitude to UN Women Training Center for supporting an emergent way of doing that. And the workshop is designed for those who have responsibility for gender equality, but are not necessarily experts, although we sometimes have gender advisors. And it is also designed and builds on what Andrea and Lucy and Laxman have said to disrupt and challenge the traditional way of doing what we call gender training, which is also often gender mainstreaming training. And I think it's important to acknowledge, as they have, that tens of millions of dollars have been spent on bringing bureaucrats and power holders to gender training that have rarely challenged power. And it is so encouraging to see now this kind of training linked to feminist pedagogy and other types of pedagogy that challenge inequality. So in this training, there are 3 modules. You'll see the first is the power of purpose, and that is a space for individuals to first deal with themselves, their own power and their own privilege. And I would say that that has been the missing element of many efforts to do gender training. And then the second is about strategies, and the third is about taking action. Next slide, please. We use as a kind of framing for the training, you have to keep hitting this one because the circles keep bouncing in and out. We use something that was developed by Srilata Baliwala, who has written a lot on feminist organizing. And so we start with helping people to understand their own power and privilege and making the point that, you know, it's not bad to have power and privilege. It's how you use your power and privilege that is the issue. And so we provide a space for people to do a lot of individual reflection on their own power and privilege, and then move to purpose. So these are the 5 Ps, and then have space for people to explore the values that underpin their action, then politics and practice, and finally partnerships. And the workshop is structured so that people have a lot of reflective time, and they work in cohorts of 4 people. So they're constantly discussing and getting feedback from each other. It's participatory, participant-centered, and there is a lot of focus on intersectional discrimination and intersectional analysis. Next slide, please. Yeah, you have to hit through all of those things going up. That's it. Thank you. The other lens we use in this workshop is the Gender at Work Analytical Framework. This was developed by Aruna Rao and David Kelleher, who were co-founders of Gender at Work, and it's a 4-quadrant framework that can be used to map opportunities, challenges, strategies, and results. It builds on 2 axes. The vertical axis goes from individual to systemic, and the horizontal goes from formal to informal or visible to invisible. So the bottom right are the formal visible rules, policies, and laws. So all these gender strategies and gender equality laws, et cetera, live there. The upper right are resources. So a lot of laws, policies, strategies are intended to free up resources to be used for gender equality, and sometimes they actually do. Often they don't. The upper left is about the informal individual, so the attitudes and consciousness that individuals carry with them. And then the bottom are the deep structures, the social norms and deep structures that hold gender inequality in place, which align with what Andrea was talking about in relation to unmasking the familiar and making it strange. Next slide, please. So a lot of what we do in this workshop is help people to, because often, you know, we focus on the right side, what's visible, what can be counted. And what we're trying to do in this training, aligning with all three panelists have said, is really focus on what is less seen. Individual attitudes and deep structures that hold gender inequality in place, or as we say, the power to make the rules, which is what we're all dealing with, and what we see happening in practice, but often don't name. So in the workshop, participants are supported to analyze the left hand, and particularly the lower left hand. And we support a process with participants of thinking about how they use their power and privilege. We use the wheel of privilege, and then move to how do you use your power and privilege, and everybody has some power and privilege, to unseat or unstick these deep structures. Next slide, please. Okay, you can skip through that one. This is just an example of using the gender framework to map strategies, and particularly if you look at the lower left-hand side. We used it to explain how you would map a strategy, for instance, for securing a Security Council agreement on Security Council Resolution 1820 on rape as a tactic of war. And that before you could actually start to call for change, to call for a resolution or a policy, you needed to understand that there was this deep structure of a belief system that boys will be boys and rape is collateral damage from war. And so until you address that deep structure, you couldn't actually move beyond to things like resolutions and resources. Next slide, please. This just builds on some of the really important, and Andrea referred to this as well, feminist thinking on power that Srilata and Lisa Venneklassen and John Gaventa have been doing. And we use this slide after we do a simulation that builds on the kind of hidden theater, informed theater that Andrea and Lucy were talking about. So we do a simulation where there is a threat of the dissolution of the gender equality team, and we form a fishbowl, and 8 people in the training have to figure out how to save the gender equality team, and in that process they're actually exercising power, and then we do an analysis. And finally, last slide please, just to end by saying that we put all this in the context of feminist leadership for gender equality, and how important it is as we approach 2020 that we really call out the way gender training has been done traditionally and incorporate so much more of what Andrea, Lucy, and Laxman have been talking about in the kind of training that we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was wonderful. So we've had 4 incredibly excellent presentations, and we've received some brilliant questions from our audience members. And I'd like to pose some of these to our speakers today. We're running a bit short on time, but I think we can go a little bit over our time limit. So what I'm gonna do is I'll change onto my screen. And can you all see my the questions now that are on your screen?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm gonna unmute Laxman, Andrea, and Lucy's had to leave us, but she will be happy to answer your questions later on. Okay, so is it on the full screen? Okay. Okay, so now you can see the questions on the screen. So our first question is from Shreya, who said that she faces problems with gatekeepers. And I think this is a really important question for us in our field. How do I deal with the male gatekeepers who won't allow training for gender equality to occur? So if you want to speak about resistances, I think this is a really good resistance to start with. So I don't know which one of Laxman or Joanne, do either of you want to answer this question?
Joanna, you want to?
Go ahead, Laxman.
Sure. I think, with the gatekeepers, yeah, that's a big, bit of quite a challenge there. But I think with some of the works that we and some of our members in the countries and the regions have been doing, they have been able to find some innovative ways on how do we really engage the gatekeepers, especially the religious and cultural leaders at the community level. The interface comes with, I'm not sure if you have been following the work that Musawa does. Is what they have trying to do is to put on critical feminist analysis on the scripture itself and find avenues where there are common elements that they could agree on, and taking that as an entry point to start engaging with them so that they can take some progressive steps on a step-by-step level. Obviously, that will not necessarily mean that they will be necessarily coming to the point of the fundamental issues such as bodily autonomy or sexual rights or issues of dismantling patriarchy in a sense. But there will be some avenues that we can start engaging with. One example has been violence against women, which has been kind of a well accepted term and issue among some of the gatekeepers, and utilizing that as an entry point to then start building on that. But again, it's a love and hate relationship always as we move forward. But there are some tools that we can share with you if you are interested on that.
And this is Joanne. I would just jump in, Shreya. I don't know what you mean by such training, if you mean just regular gender training or gender training that actually addresses patriarchy, power, and privilege. And just to say that I've met gatekeepers all across the gender spectrum that won't allow such training, not just men. I think the thing about gatekeepers is that there are so many of them. And so there are those who will and those who won't. And one of the things about working in a bureaucracy is, or at any level, right, is trying to find those gatekeepers who are supportive and then let them deal with the other gatekeepers, because what I'm taking from your question is that you don't have the access, or that access is difficult for you. You can't do it alone. You need a community, and you need to, and I think we do this too infrequently, you need to organize inside organizations and help that majority voice that wants this kind of training be the majority voice.
That's an excellent point, Joanne. And I think it ties in a bit with the third question that was posed by both Odyomo and Oiko, who both asked that, do you think that feminist pedagogies differ depending on which part of the world you're in? And is feminist pedagogy shaped by culture or religion in each country, or do you use models? Do you have to create models for each culture, or do you adapt a model of feminist pedagogy to these cultures? And I wonder what both of you have to say about this.
Should I go first this time, Laxman?
Sure.
Is Andrea off the phone already?
I can't see that she's online, but I'm trying to get in touch with her.
It says offline. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, of course, feminist pedagogy is absolutely shaped by culture, religion, race, class, many things. I think that when you're doing, as we are, when you're building your pedagogy on a participatory approach, one of the things that happens is that in the context of, say, doing a workshop or, you know, a consultation or some engagement, people claim the concepts and translate them into their own contexts. And we've, you know, I'm just thinking about the last workshop we did with UN Women, where we talk about, we have participants listen to a podcast on toxic masculinity and then do a participatory activity around it. And there were a group of women from Sudan who were really bothered by that term, toxic masculinity. And it was really interesting, and the concepts, and it was really interesting to watch them figure out what that concept meant in their culture and reclaim it for their culture and rename it for their culture. So I think that absolutely it is shaped, and the way that you do training and participatory engagement enables those pedagogical concepts to, because they're dynamic, to change as you're working with people from different cultures and contexts.
Excellent. Laxman, do you want to jump in there too?
No, absolutely. I think then connecting also to the fourth question there on how have we seen resistance within the organizations. But definitely, yes. You know, I come from Save the Children background, working with children and young people, and I can definitely say yes, there is. Because of for the fact, you know, what Lucy was mentioning, you know, the feminist pedagogy actually questions everything, literally, which are within the system where we are operating, because most of them are quite patriarchal. So that does bring disruption, discomfort, and hence the resistance as well from especially the leadership. And to the point that Joanna was talking about on challenging or differently define or try to define the leadership differently from a feminist perspective does bring challenge, and we have to utilize based on the local context and the knowledge. But I think the feminist pedagogy, again, when we talk about feminism, I think we have to remember it's feminisms that we are talking about. So for me, I think that becomes important is to learn from the local feminist leadership on how your idea around certain pedagogy might be helpful and not. And for me, that becomes an important element as well. And that helps addressing some of the resistances that you get usually from cultures or organizations.
That's an excellent point. And I think that also...
I would just...
No, go on, Joanne, please, sorry.
No, I was just going to build on what Laxman said and address questions 2 and 4, because I think they're also related. I think, no, all privileged groups are not always the oppressors, and that's what we try to do in our workshops, is actually to make the point that privilege, first of all, everybody has some type of privilege, and so figuring out what your privilege and power is important. And then the question of how you use your privilege and power to advance women's rights and gender equality and inclusion and human rights is really what we want to talk about. We don't want to demonize people for having privilege and power. We want them to use it for good outcomes and for a more inclusive society. And I think that that is also relevant to question number 4, because I think that it is true that in more formal situations, people get very nervous about participatory centered initiatives because they like to control, but they're the first people to relax once you demonstrate that you can create a participatory environment and you can hold it in a way that is respectful of everybody's rights in the room.
Yeah, no, just helping the facilitator here, just connecting second as well as to the 5th question on the screen. Do they always, and especially from a working with boys and men perspective, I think by virtue of the fact that the constituency of men and male identified individuals becomes quite, sort of challenging, and the issue of, your own implicitness around what is going on. There was, that question always comes in on feeling of, do I need to speak up? And if you decide not to speak up as well, that's your privilege that you are not going to speak against certain violations of human rights or inequalities. So I think, yeah, it's a nuanced approach to understand how inadvertently we do become part of the system of oppression and discrimination, but also looking at some of the new way of looking at the trainings. I'm not very sure what you mean by traditional gender trainings, but I think what I understood probably is around, sometimes, in South Asian context or in African context as well, it might be helpful to even talk about power and discrimination without using the word gender. That have worked as well. So, but obviously, challenging tradition and culture is something we will eventually do. I don't think there is a way out, because ultimately that's what we are trying to challenge anyway.
I agree. And I think this sort of ties in with the sixth question, which is on the screen now, that, one thing that Anand from Samyak pointed out was that when we're speaking about what men and women should do, we're still using binaries as a model for analysis. As you just said, male identified people, so we have to take that into account, that we do tend to operate in binaries, and that can be very problematic. And I think that ties in with Adriana's question, which is, if we expand notions of gender to include LGBTIQ identities, this is a challenge that many trainers face. And I wonder if either of you or both of you have any strategies or tools that you have when we approach these kind of issues.
I use, yes, and it's partly by making that very clear at the very beginning. We first of all introduced that notion in the workshop agreements right at the very beginning, that we're not talking about a binary, we're talking about a spectrum, and that these notions are constantly changing and dynamic. The other thing that we use is there's a 3-minute YouTube called Trans Men Talk About Male Privilege. And it is just very lighthearted, but really hard-hitting, has an amazing impact. And again, we've used it, and it's people who have transitioned from being women to men, talking about how they have finally understood male privilege. And it is so, we've used it with people from all over the world. Its message is immediately understood, and it's great to stimulate a discussion about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, the whole conversation around gender tends to become very binary focused and oriented as well. And I think, we tend to use different terms. The reason I was including male identified was just to also the fact that it's not male I'm talking about, but the fact that the patriarchy favors the male group or those associated with male identities in a way. That was what I was trying to bring. But definitely, yes, that's something we need to bring in more frequently and in the trainings. And I think, Anand keeps on also using this interesting model called circle of invitation. And that opens up to disrupt some of these ideas, but also to, yeah, I think, there are tools that we can use further. Wish we could have more time, actually.
So do I. I wonder if either of you see any of the questions on the screen now that you'd also like to address, because we're going to have to wrap up very shortly, but if there's anything specific that you'd like to touch on.
Well, I think number 7 from Suhail, and I think you probably can speak about this in relation to UN Women, but absolutely, I would just encourage all listening not to hesitate to use things like theater and videos and music and drawing with people who identify as lawmakers or bureaucrats or officials, because there is a lot of reluctance. People have been telling me for 40 years not to use those techniques, and I will tell you that those techniques are especially important for people who work in the formal sector.
I agree. Do you wanna address any of these questions? We also have two more. I'm gonna switch over to another screen.
No, I think there was a specific one for Andrea, but the number 10 probably in terms of the epistemology or some of the, I think Lucy tossed on some of those, and I think for me, what becomes really important is under any perspective theoretical ideologies we use, the underlying factor is how can we question some of the things that we have not really considered for a while. I think that on in itself becomes a foundational pillar, maybe it with the whole questioning of everything that operates in a way that is currently operating, challenging the whole understanding of gender binary. And that's where all the ideas around, creating reflections and deconstruction of the fact around reflecting on our own multiple identities we carry among ourselves, not necessarily only limited to men and women, but also those which are socially described to be a man in a particular context might be something that resonates with women. So just having those, and as an individual, we fall down the spectrum of these different ideologies, and how do we bring that reflection to bring in and cut across the binary language that is there. So yeah, that's
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Joanne, do you want to add anything, or?
Just to say to Chris that I think that's a really good point. We spend a lot of time talking about this because this whole notion of announcing your pronoun, I think addressing your privilege, absolutely, but announcing your pronoun is still so unfamiliar to so many people, and in some cases can start this other discussion that kind of takes us off on a different track. So I'd really be interested in other people's experiences of how you deal with this in with groups that are from many, many different cultures and communities where this is such a foreign concept. And how can training ensure the eradication of fears which men hold on to? I don't think it can. I think that it can start to provoke questions. It can start, hopefully, to provoke dialogue and those kinds of things. But eradicating the fear that patriarchy has instilled in all of us is an ongoing and collective initiative that we have to work on in every space we're in, not just in training workshops. But thanks for that question.
Right. So just to quickly address that as well, with recent experience with training with UN DSS leadership recently, last year actually, not recently, exactly that brought this point actually around the fear, what actually counts as fear. Ultimately then it becomes like, am I to then give up my position? Then I will be jobless. So I think, again, that has to do with the way we intervene into the conversation. I think that's where the reflexivity of helping them to go slightly above than just locating themselves in the picture might be helpful. It won't necessarily eradicate fear, but definitely install. But I think the point is not to eradicate fear. The point is to make them live with the discomfort for a while, so that they start interrogating around their own roles and responsibilities that then can enable them to use their own power and privilege to do for good and what they are supposed to be doing in those positions, and not stick or currently in the UN system, there is a huge backlash against even gender parity initiative, which is there. And I think we will be doing some trainings around that. But I think, absolutely. I think it's not about, it's about fear, but also about helping people live with the discomfort that they need to be reflecting on after the trainings. And agree on the pronouns. Sorry about that. We should have said that, and I use he for now. In future, that may change, but for now it's he, and that probably becomes helpful in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laxman. And thank you very much, Joanne. Both of you and Andrea and Lucy have been such wonderful speakers, and I've been very, very privileged to have you all here with us today. And thank you so much to all of our audience members for all of your questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but there were even more that were sent in. But this is where we come to the next steps, and I'd like to draw all of your attention to the fact that we do have a community of practice discussion forum, which is open now. And if you go to the Training Center's website, trainingcenter.unwomen.org/portal, you can log into the portal and access the COP by selecting My Courses and then Community of Practice. And if you aren't a COP member, you can join at any time and contribute. And if you need any help, you can contact me directly via email. And we have recorded this webinar, and it will be available on YouTube. And we will be sending everyone who registered and everyone who participated the recording link and the link to the PowerPoint presentation and all of the other links to the resources that were mentioned by all of our wonderful speakers. So all of you will have access to those by tomorrow. So I just want to thank you all again for being with us today. Oh, and I should also mention that we do have, but you're all going to receive a follow-up email, and that we are going to write up a final report summarizing the discussions that we've had today and the discussions that will continue to happen in the discussion forum. And that will be available and circulated to all of you in July. So I want to thank you all again. Thank you so much, Joanne. Thank you so much, Laxman. Thank you so much, Lucy and Andrea, and all of our participants in the audience for being with us today. And this is an exceptionally excellent webinar, and we hope you'll take away a lot from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruya. Thank you, UN Women.
Thank you.